Okay, so we already heard, we've heard a lot today about the benefits of public financing. This panel we're going to focus on how we make public financing a reality, and not just a reality, but a successful reality. Obviously, getting a public financing system passed, if nobody's participating in it, or if it doesn't fundamentally change the way candidates interact with their constituents or the way citizens participate, there's not necessarily a lot of point to passing such a program. To just give some context of recent history with public financing and efforts for public financing, we saw last year a public financing bill become law in Montgomery County, Maryland. That's the largest county in Maryland. On the other hand, in the past couple of years, we've had a heartbreakingly close failed attempt in New York State, where it lost by 1 vote in the Senate. In New Mexico, where the legislature passed a public financing bill, but it was vetoed by the governor. And in Seattle, where we had a closely fought but lost attempt to get public financing passed on the ballot through a ballot measure. In the coming months, we have efforts to create or strengthen programs in Seattle, Chicago, Santa Fe, and Maine, among other locales. So I'm hopeful that this panel can give us some insights on how we win and how we preserve those wins to ensure that the system works. There's probably not a better person to start us off on that conversation than Karen Hobert Flynn. Karen is the Senior Vice President for Strategy and Programs at Common Cause. She has been involved with Common Cause since 1985 and was a key leader in the campaign in Connecticut for the first legislatively passed clean money public financing system for statewide and legislative races that was adopted in 2005. She is also currently engaged in Common Cause's efforts to improve public financing systems in California and to establish a public financing system in Chicago. So Karen, how do we do it?
Well, not easily, but one, I want to say what a great discussion it's been today, and I'm honored to be here and want to thank the campaign finance, the New York City Campaign Finance Board, Brennan Center, and CED, all of whom we've worked with and benefited from their wisdom, their legal defense, or their support for our efforts on small donor public financing. And I'm here to talk about what we did in Connecticut primarily, in Connecticut, where we had a former governor go to jail and a series of scandals. But I do want to point out that scandals don't always lead to reform. We have seen scandals, governors, state legislators, mayors, city council members, many hundreds of cases where we've seen corruption that does not lead to reform. So there is work that has to be done to lay the foundation and groundwork so that you can move that. But also, as Larry mentioned, we also have real opportunities that are moving out in the states and at the municipal level. And in Montgomery County, for instance, Common Cause, Maryland, and Progressive Maryland, and PERG and other allies worked on this, and it wasn't as a result of a scandal that moved this along. Every Voice was another another group that was working on that at the state level. But we have seen an enormous interest in cities and states across the country, and in many places over the next 2 or 3 years, we are going to see dozens of jurisdictions looking to move small donor public financing. And many of them, it's not about scandal, it's about people wanting to reclaim their government. And so we don't have a chance to talk about those today, but Common Cause is often working on those in Chicago, in other places. We have an opportunity to move reform, and Every Voice and many local groups are working on this in Seattle, and they're experimenting with a voucher system, which is exciting. We see Maine, which is one of the clean money states like Connecticut that passed it through ballot initiative, working to strengthen their program to replace trigger funds that were struck down by yet another Supreme Court ruling, Arizona Free Enterprise case, that basically said, struck down those resources that publicly financed candidates can get if they're the victim of independent expenditures, which is what we've seen a huge increase and rise in, or if they run against wealthy candidates. So I wanted to walk through some of what we did in Connecticut, because I think that a lot of what we did and the success was less about the scandal and more about the organizing work that we did around that. So first, just to give a quick, a couple people may know about what John Rowland did, but he went to jail after accepting lavish gifts from contractors with business before the state and lobbyists. And there was a broad coalition of groups who embarked on a 15-month campaign to put pressure on the legislature and the new governor, Jody Rell, who was the lieutenant governor and stood by John Rowland's side for 10 years. She was not part of his inner circle. She was, she was somebody that would go out and do promotional events and other things, but she was not part of the corruption in any way. And so when she came into office, she had to prove that she didn't stand with him, and she had to show that she was a reformer. She's also a Republican who said at the outset when we first met with her, I don't like public financing. So we had a little bit of a challenge in our hands. And part of that challenge was the groundwork we had laid. We had worked literally for 10 years before to try and move public financing. Though in those 10 years, we had worked to pass measures for public finance for statewide races. So we had bill after bill. First year would get through one committee. We were always given high hurdles. We would have to get it through 5 committees, which is hard to do in a few months, and then get it to the floor of the House and Senate to pass it. So we'd get it through one committee. The next year, we would get it as far as 5 committees, and it'd come to the floor of the House, and it would die unceremoniously, and several of our co-sponsors would go south on us. So that was in 97. We brought it back in 98, 99, 2000. We brought the bill, passed it through the House and Senate, and Governor Rowland vetoed it. But each time that we were pushing to move reform, you create a huge effort and pressure on the legislature, and each time they felt like they had to give us something. So along the way, we also enacted a lot of the infrastructure reforms that you need for any public financing program to succeed. So among those, we passed strong disclosure so we could better track occupation employer, who's giving, where's the corruption. We passed a soft money ban. We passed issue ad disclosure. So each step along the way, we kept adding to our campaign finance infrastructure. And it also, over time, familiarized members of the legislature with what reform looks like. And I can remember we would improve. We would listen to the criticisms. At that time, the Republicans were all opposing it. And I can remember sitting in the gallery, and a state rep came up, and he said, I have to hand it to you. Every single argument I made last time when you had this bill, you have fixed. He's like, my hat's off to you because I know it's going through. So we learned along the way, we improved, we learned from other jurisdictions. We also brought in people who run under public financing programs from other jurisdictions. So we needed to convince a Republican governor and a number of Republicans that this is something they could live with. So there was a reform group, it was called the Reform Institute, led by John McCain, that we did some work with early on, and John McCain came and visited with Jody Rell and talked about the public financing program in Arizona and how it was effective in reducing corruption. We brought Betsy Bayless, who was a Republican Secretary of State, to talk about that. She had a closed-door meeting with Republicans to talk through the ins and outs of it. We brought Democrats and Republicans down from Maine to come talk about what it's like to live under these programs. And a lot of those times when we did it, we were not part of those conversations so that they could have member-to-member discussions and sort of iron out some of the things that they feared. Also, when we worked on this, we built over time a 50-member coalition. And what we'd find is there was a cadre of groups that worked on this all the time. And when opportunity looked real, where it looked like we really could move reform, that's when more groups would come to the table and work on it. And funders, and many of you who work in this space know that you need good, strong funding to move reform, often would insist on, some kind of outside campaign structure. Put a campaign in place so that they can pass it, and then they move out. Common Cause and Citizen Action Groups said, no, it's got to be groups on the ground. We have the relationships, we know how the system operates, and we insisted on having an integrated staff. So we added a number of organizers and other folks, but it was always the core groups that were running this. And that decision became very important later, because one of the things that people don't think about with reform is you've got to defend the reform, you've got to implement it, and there needs to be people around to make sure that happens. So we also, because it was groups on the ground, we had credibility because we had worked on reform issues over time. And actually reform issues, those smaller measures on disclosure and other things we passed, we'd often work with Republicans. So we were able to work with the governor's office and Republicans as we tried to move towards public financing. The other thing is the coalition groups on the ground. When we met with Jody Rell, first up would say, she said, I would love to shut down all these loopholes. And she would walk through, I'd like some pay-to-play measures, ban state contractors from giving, ban lobbyist gifts, and she would have a whole laundry list. And we said, we are absolutely open to shutting down all of that, but if you don't create an alternative system like public financing, it's not going to be real reform. You have to have that alternative. So we stuck with that, and as a coalition, would continue to make sure that we had principles that we would all agree on, because as anybody knows that moves reform through a legislative system, there's going to be compromises, things are going to be gutted, and you need to figure out where you're going to fight and what you can let go of. The other thing is that we had Democratic Speaker of the House, a Democratic president and Senate president, and then the Republican governor. And one of the things that they wanted to do is sort of play the blame game. The Senate president isn't any good on this, the Senate is terrible, it's the House Speaker and the governor that cares about reform, and always finger pointing. And we went through an entire legislative session where the House had a bill and the Senate had a bill, and they couldn't agree, and the session ended, and they said, what can we do? And we had resources to do ad campaigns, grassroots organizing. We commissioned a poll that found that voters wanted the governor and the legislature to work together on a solution. And so we called for a special session, which they did not want to see. Another point that we made along the way around the scandal is the legislators suggested we do gift reform. One of the problems we had was, Roland was greedy. He took gifts. So let's just do some gift reform, revamp the Ethics Commission, and that's all we need to do. So the campaign finance analysis that we did really looked at where the corruption trail began, and our slogan was the corruption trail began on the campaign trail. And we did research that found that the gift givers who gave to his lakeside cottage, a hot tub, and other things, actually gave 10 times more money in campaign contributions over 2 election cycles than they ever did in the illegal gifts. And it wasn't just about the gifts, it was about the no-bid contracts that Roland would get when he was doing that. One other thing that we had that I think is important is really strong press coverage of the issue. Because we had a scandal with, continual revelations coming out. Our media, our press corps at the Capitol got really hungry for stories about this. And so we capitalized on that when we were pushing for reform. We did studies and polls. There was a pissing match between the different chambers to say who's a better reformer. And so the news coverage of it was excellent. And in the 15 months we had our campaign, we were in the news every single week, whether it was op-eds, editorials, or news coverage, except for 2 weeks in August. And that is from the fall of 2004 to December 1, when we passed the bill. That's a lot of news coverage. And in fact, when there was an independent assessment of the Connecticut campaign, there was interviews of reporters. And the funny thing is that the reporters feel like they were the ones that were absolutely instrumental in getting reform. They discounted the work, and they probably didn't know all the work we did, but they felt like it was their coverage, their keeping the feet to the fire, of the electeds, that helped do it. And it was really interesting. So we went through the House and Senate session, no agreement. And so when we came out with our poll saying the people want you to work together, the Senate Speaker called us into his office 5 minutes before the press conference and said, we've decided to put together a working group so that we can iron out the differences, which was terrific. And so we then had about a 10-week period to educate a whole new number of legislators about what the reform might look like and try and reach agreement on it. And those 2 weeks in August where we had no press coverage, I remember many of our allies weren't around. It was just Andy Sauer and I from Common Cause walking over to the Capitol. And I remember saying to him, did someone kill this and not let us know that it's dead? Are we the only two people up here worrying about this stuff? But part of it was we had the resources to continue to hang with the legislators. They wanted to run out the clock and not take care of this. And both pressure from outside groups, from reporters, and studies that we would do help keep their feet to the fire. So when the working group came out and they came very close to consensus, they just had issues about when they would phase in all of the pay-to-play reforms, if they would do it before the public financing or after. We were very close. And the Speaker said, well, we couldn't reach agreement. There's nothing more we can do. And we organized Democratic House members to sign a letter asking the governor to call a special session in defiance of their Speaker. And they got called on the carpet for it, but they did it. We used that in part. The governor called a special session several times, and it was at that point legislators decided this wasn't going to go away. So they started to put together internal working groups to walk through what the reform would mean. They felt the pressure, they felt like they had to do it. And so some of what we did was to look at creating a program that isn't based on what a good government group like Common Cause says, but talking to political operatives. What does it take to run a winning campaign? What are the kinds of limits that people could live with, so they're in district limits? And we walked through some of that. One of the things we found, and I'm not going to go through all the details, but if you look at the grants per district population, one of the things you'll see is that Connecticut's grants are very generous. So it gives them more resources, and I actually think it's one of the reasons why the program has been successful. We eventually passed in special session on December 1st a bill that put in place public financing for all statewide races and General Assembly races. And we didn't know if we were going to do it until the vote happened. In fact, the morning of the vote, I got a call from my friend, and the governor didn't know I had a friend in her office, but I did. And she said that the staff doesn't know if they are going to come in and work on this bill or if they're not going to work on it. And I said, you tell them that this bill has every single thing she said she wanted. And we will label her the one who killed reform if you don't get out there and start working the votes. And sure enough, they were out there and they worked the votes. And we were able to get a third of the Republican caucus in the Senate to vote for the bill. Some of those we had identified, and some she helped twist their arms, and also some Republicans in the House. One of the important things that I think reformers don't think about, and I learned the hard way. When you pass something like this, you almost don't have a moment to breathe. Because one, you have to start working on implementation. And so the coalition you put together needs to focus on it. You need to be ready because some of the reforms we passed was a state contractor and lobbyist ban. So let me tell you, we were the most hated people in the Capitol because lobbyists who had had all kinds of power had none. So the Lobbyist Association sued, the Green Party, we had many different lawsuits. And one, I want to call out Chisun Lee and others at the Brennan Center that helped us defend this. We had to go through legal defense at a district court level, Second Circuit Court of Appeals, and also they petitioned for cert at the Supreme Court, and thankfully the court didn't take this. But months and months of discovery and legal fights around this. We also had to put in place, and I should say Democracy 21 and the Campaign Legal Center also helped us at the Supreme Court level to successfully defend this law. You also have to put in place strong infrastructure like the New York City Campaign Finance Board. And so at the time, our bill had funding for maybe 3 additional positions. And I met with the head of elections enforcement. I don't know if I ever told you this. And he said, you know, I'd like to hire you to implement this. And I said, you've got to be kidding. You need somebody who knows what they're doing. We should look at other, boards that do this. And so Connecticut hired Beth Rotman, who worked with Nicole Gordon, who's here today, which we're very grateful for because she came in and said, you're going to need a couple $1 million more. We need auditors. Here are the kinds of people we need. Here's the infrastructure you need to make sure this can succeed. It's a big program, and you have to make sure it operates well. If it doesn't, the political will, they'll get rid of it right away. So that's really important as well. The other thing is when you have a big bill that does many things, you have to do a lot of fixes. So we put through fixes in 2006, 2007, 2008, 2009, 2010, twice, because that was the year Citizens United came down, and we had to come up with some disclosure reform that year. Fixes in 2011, 12, and 13. So there's tinkering, there is defense of our funding system. We had to come up with a funding system that a Republican governor could live with. That meant not taxpayer dollars. So that's one of the things you have to think about. And we both succeeded in coming up with something and did something that put us within some vulnerability. What we did, I carried around the state budget for a couple of months because you got to look for sources of money. And what we used is unclaimed assets, which is not taxpayer money. It's money that's been laying around. The state treasurer tries to get to the people who may have left it in a banking account or whatever else, and then eventually it comes into the state. And the amount can vary from $10 million to $120 million, but it's usually about at least $20 million a year. So what we did was had $17 million, we later increased it to 18, come into the program so that we could be ready in our inaugural year in 2008. The challenge is it was too much money. So as we had deficits and other challenges, it became a sitting pot that they would draw from when they needed it. A couple of years ago, as one of the fixes that was slipped in, was a fix to say if there are not enough resources, they will get the rest from the general fund. So it sort of inoculates us if they raid the fund during critical times. So as we are as Paul Ryan mentioned earlier, one of the challenges, we've had a lot of court cases, the Arizona Free Enterprise System that knocked out trigger funds, Citizens United that unleashed a flood of money in Speech Now. And so some of those things have made it challenging for our program. And without a doubt, we've moved on disclosure. We have to tighten some of our coordination rules. And we also have to find a funding source that can replace those triggers in case people are victims of independent expenditures. We've seen significant independent expenditures at the gubernatorial level, but not at the General Assembly level yet. So one of the challenges is people are afraid, but they haven't seen enough money to make them so afraid they're ready to act. And so we have to continue to work with them to move that. The last thing I'd say is, and you'll see this and hear this as we talk about public financing in Chicago, it's really important to build very broad coalitions, bringing in constituencies that are often not represented at the Capitol. And also a vision for why public financing can serve their needs. We have seen remarkable bills pass through our legislature as we've seen more and more candidates come in. We have participation rates around 72 to 74%, and even as we've seen Maine and Arizona's participations go down, ours has remained very steady, with about 72% of, thanks to Josh, of Republicans participating and 82% of Democrats. So, we have to continue to look at ways to engage them in what a fix could look like. So it's important that the coalition sees that they can get reforms, environmental reforms. We were the first state to pass paid sick leave. It's no accident that happened in a place like Connecticut, because so many people are elected and don't feel beholden to special interests. And so that coalition can both help when it comes time to defend the program. So I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to take questions later. And I think I'll skip the video.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Thanks, Karen. So to my right is Mike Petro. Mike is the Executive Vice President of the Committee for Economic Development of the Conference Board. And for those of you who don't know, CED is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, business-led public policy organization that delivers analysis and reasoned solutions to our nation's most critical issues. Mike has worked at CED for 17 years, and of particular note for today's conference are Mike's efforts to engage and mobilize business leaders around campaign finance reform. CED was and is an exceptionally valuable ally in efforts to get public financing passed in New York State, and it's currently very, very involved in the effort to get public financing passed in Chicago. So Mike, I'm hoping you could talk a little bit about CED's efforts in Chicago and why CED is behind passing small donor public financing. To some, it might be surprising that this is a priority for a business organization.
Well, thank you, Larry, and thanks to all the panelists. Can you hear me okay here? Yes. Okay, great. And I want to thank the Brennan Center and the New York City Campaign Finance Board for co-sponsoring this event. I'm a New Yorker. I live in Washington, D.C., but I was born in Astoria, Queens, and I have a long New York State background, and I am not related to Congressman Petro, who's in the back of the room and who I have admired from afar. So we're separated by just one vowel. When I met my wife, she wanted to know if I was Petro. She wanted to know if I was from the oil company Petro, and I was like, no, I'm one of the Astoria Petros. So, in any event, and then I'll tell you another quick funny story. My father was a newspaper reporter for the New York Herald Tribune, and someone had mentioned Mayor Lindsay, and Mayor Lindsay was a wonderful man, but he had this idea of putting together a touch football game to ease the tensions between City Hall and the press. So there was a touch football game in Central Park in 1966, and my dad played for the press. And of course, within the first few minutes, the game became a tackle football game. And a fight ensued, and at one particular moment, my father tackled Mayor Lindsay, and they slid into an area where horses had been standing for quite a while. Front page of all the papers, my dad and Mayor Lindsay sitting there in horse manure, and we never got invited back to City Hall. So it's so good. It's so good to be here. So I work for a group, it's called the Committee for Economic Development, and it's a business-led organization. It's been around since the 1940s. It engages CEOs. We have about 180 CEOs from around the country. It engages CEOs in a vast group of policy, domestic and foreign policy issues. Education policy is something that we've taken on. We're very, very concerned about the economy and healthcare. And so you ask the question, why would this organization that helped bring you the Marshall Plan care about democratic institutions and care about things like campaign finance reform? Well, first of all, I think what's important to note is that, business leaders understand that there's an economic component to this issue. They understand that in order to thrive as a business, you need essentially a strong democratic institution. You need a strong democracy. And our members get the fact that, a lot of our members do business in foreign countries, and what they see is when they see breakdowns in the political systems, or if they see corruption, they immediately are wary and they pull back because they're concerned about what this will do to the economy and what this will do to their own businesses. In fact, CED is going to release a study this fall. It's on crony capitalism, and it's basically, it raises the concern that as government has grown, there have been deals between business and government, and those deals sometimes are bad for the economy. They distort markets, they stifle innovation. So one of the ways to engage the business community around these issues is talking about this in pure economic terms, right? Because sometimes when you hit them with public funding, they immediately, that's a label that they pull back from. But if you talk about the fact that you need a strong and vibrant economy to do business, and that currently the system is hurting the economy, sometimes those issues resonate with them. Now, CED has supported this small dollar match for over a decade. We actually recommended it for congressional elections. And as business leaders, one of the things that they saw that really moved them was they saw that it encouraged competition, right? So business leaders, they don't like competition because they want to beat the competition, but they know instinctually that competition is a good thing for the economy. It's a good thing for business overall. So therefore, adding more competition in the political system ought to be a good thing. And so that was one of the things that pushed our members over the line to support this public funding. To get a group of moderate to conservative business leaders to support any aspect of public funding is quite rare. And I think one of the reasons why they did was we appealed to their sense that this was a pro-competition issue, and they were alarmed by the incumbents and the fact that each and every year they just get elected and reelected without anybody running against them. In a former life, I worked for Senator John Glenn, who was a wonderful man. And every 6 years, John Glenn would get reelected to the United States Senate because he was an American hero. Everybody loved John Glenn. What was there not to like, right? Well, in 1992, there was a whole new generation. We just come off of a recession. There was a whole new generation of people that don't remember John Glenn. They didn't remember his orbit around the Earth. They didn't remember the fact that he was a war hero. And quite frankly, they were asking him some really tough questions. Well, he had competition that year, and he had to fight for his seat. And he won, eventually, re-election. But I would argue he became a better campaigner and a better senator because he was forced to answer to the people. And our members, that's all we want more than that, but that's what we're hoping, is that by adding additional voices to the campaigns, we know this is not gonna overnight change the world, but we do know that if you add additional voices to campaigns, even if those campaigns fail, you put the incumbent in the situation of having to work harder to win the election, and I would argue work harder to support the people and serve the people. So that's been our rationale for supporting this issue. What we are doing, our members, it's funny, our members have urged us to go out into the country and talk about these issues at the state and local level. One of my business leaders said, if Congress is messing around with our credit rating, what makes you think they're going to deal with campaign finance reform? go out into places where you have Democrats and Republicans who are at least willing to talk about this issue. So about a year and a half ago, we put together a group, a luncheon, and we brought Amy Loprest from the Campaign Finance Board to talk to a group of business leaders about what's happening in New York and what the system is like here in New York. And you had these hard-edged Chicago business guys talking amongst themselves afterward and saying, well, geez, if they can do it in New York, maybe we can do it in Chicago, and there's this all kind of back and forth. Well, lo and behold, within 8 or 9 months, a movement starts to build. And it wasn't just because of CED, there's Common Cause, a whole group of organizations have worked to push this. The bottom line is that they happened to get this public financing match on a referendum vote, and in February, with not a large campaign, it won by 78% of the vote. So the people of Chicago said, we like this idea, let's go for it. And at the same time, we had built this kind of business infrastructure who, at the very least, were telling others, you know what, it's not a bad thing for us to consider. Let's at least think about this. And now, there's a huge hurdle that has to go over, that's still left, which is that even though this passed a referendum, Chicago, the Chicago City Council has to now put this in place and then vote on it. So, you know, there's a long way to go. But we put together this group of business leaders that are now supporting it. We're going to have the FEC chair, Ann Rowell, come and talk to these business leaders in October. And our hope is that Chicago will mimic what's happening in New York, in Los Angeles, and other places, and that those are the victories that we need across the country. And so what I would say to you is don't, you know, I know that you probably think that business is the bad guy, a lot of folks in this room, but don't ignore the business community. There's very thoughtful business leaders who care about the country and they care about the economy, and they're tired of getting hit up for contributions. I have one of my members that calls it extortion, and he boldly talks about it as extortion. So one of the ingredients to a successful campaign, I would argue, is reaching out to business leaders and talking to them about the future of the economy and our democracy. Thanks.
Thanks, Mike. So to Mike's right, as you see, is Jared DeMarinis. Jared is the Director of Candidacy and Campaign Finance for the Maryland State Board of Elections. He is responsible for implementing and enforcing state candidacy and campaign finance laws. And he helped draft the Campaign Finance Reform Act of 2013, which, among many other important reforms, allowed counties in Maryland to establish public financing systems. Jared, Maryland has been a hive of public financing activity in the last year. In addition to Montgomery County passing its public financing system, for the first time in 20 years, you had a statewide candidate who eventually became governor, a Republican, who used the state's public financing system. So I'm hoping you might give us a little insight into how these developments came about and what they might mean for even bigger reforms in the state.
Sure. Yes, I also want to say thank you to New York City Finance Board as well for everything, and Brennan Center for inviting me to this panel to discuss this. So yes, Maryland, I always felt strange before 2014 when I had to check off the box on the questionnaires from Common Cause or from any sort of organization, whether or not Maryland had a public financing program. Because yes, there was a law on the books, it was there, but it wasn't used basically one time in its 40-year existence. It was in 1994. And that was it. And it was enacted in 1974 with all the Watergate scandals, and it took 20 years to actually get someone to use it, and then another 20 years thereafter for someone to use it again. And one of the reasons was that no serious candidate would ever take or engage in the public financing program because of the strict expenditure limit on there. And that we had people start saying that it was unworkable. We were looking at there was money in there, and basically in 2010, they started to raid the fund for this as well. And they started funding other projects with it. And they also then eliminated the tax checkoff for it as well, which was just adding on. And basically, it was kind of a dead, dormant program. And then 2014 occurred, which, you know, gives us hope for any public program out here, in my mind. We had 5 candidates actually attempt to go for the public program. 2 actually qualified, meaning that they raised seed money of over $250,000 in contributions from individuals of $250 or less. And the majority of the candidates that were attempting to qualify for the program were actually Republicans. We only had, there were 2 Democrats that attempted. 1 was successful. The rest were all Republicans, and 1 was successful there. The fringe, one of the Democrat that actually was successful, Heather Mazier, was at the time considered a kind of a fringe candidate in the Democratic primary. There were 2 well-funded candidates, Anthony Brown and Doug Gansler. And the press sort of was going to go with that. As soon as she actually qualified and took public funds, it elevated her status from being a fringe candidate to actually being a serious candidate that was viable, which was almost the opposite of what the program's detractors were saying, that, oh, this was going to make you not viable. It actually made her viable and made her a part of the debates, made her something that they could not ignore. And it changed the course of the discourse of the Democratic primary as well as the debates there, I would say for the better. On the Republican side, one candidate qualified for it. The other ones, they attempted but failed. They could not reach the seed money, which was also a part of the program, which shows that you need to have broad support to do this, which was another part of the detractors. They always say, oh, anybody in the world can qualify for these funds here. No, it actually takes some time, effort to do this. So now, Larry Hogan basically won the Republican primary and then qualified for the general election grant. And this basically, coming out of the gates with the public financing grant, I mean, there were other factors of it, but he looks at it and says, I would not have been a viable candidate for governor at this time without public financing. He points to this as that he would not be sitting in the governor's office right now if it wasn't for the public financing program. Democrats have a 2-to-1 majority in our state, and money was being spent, he was being outspent in a great deal of, I would say about 5-to-1 in the general election. But it allowed him to compete early on. And the program itself is based upon like the old style system here. It has a dollar-for-dollar match for individual contributions of $250 or less in the primary. But once you get into the general election, we just basically give you a grant of the expenditure limit and just go, this is how much money you can spend, and you can't raise any more money. This is how the system, and this is why people were also hesitant about it, because it caps you at a certain dollar figure. And the cap at that time was under $2.6 million for the general election. And since we've been pushing our primary earlier, people were saying, well, can you extend this money out and everything like that? But it was very successful. Then, during that course of that time there, we in 2013, we were able to pass the Campaign Finance Reform Act, which allowed counties to have the ability to do this. So Montgomery County took up the mantle of this. And they were looking at the state, but luckily they didn't look at the state model and say, let's adopt this model here, because I think that model was, at the time in the 70s, was perfect, because the idea was to cap what they felt was expenditures and the rise of money in politics. Well, that basically has left, that horse has left the barn here. Money is going to be in politics, and money will always be in politics. So the Montgomery program was looking at it and saying, well, let's not have the hard caps on expenditures. Let's just cap how much public monies we'll give to candidates, but allow them to keep raising beyond that, but just restrict on how the money is raised. And I believe it was the first program passed after Citizens United, but at least that's what they kept.
That's right, yes.
Yeah, so they kept on saying that. So. Montgomery was very happy about that. They're a very proud county. And so I think that kind of is now the new program, and it was basically modeled after the New York City idea, and it has it allows the first $50 to be matched at a higher level, and then it's tiered approach. So the first $50 for county executives is at a 6-to-1 match. Then the next one is then the next $50 is at a 4-to-1 match, and then a 2-to-1 match, so that you can build up. But it allows for small dollar contributions to be matched at a higher rate, so that you're going to get the most bang for your buck. And it is looking as experiments across the state here. I believe that it's important to build it up from the grassroots level. As much as I appreciate Congressman Sarbanes' efforts there, and as a Marylander too, we all know that the congressional level of reform is almost impossible to get. And even at the state level, you see in New York State here, it's very difficult to see all the interest here. You start at local levels, and you can build up from there. Because as politicians, they're just like everyone else. They're going to take the systems that works for them, and then they have ambitions. So they're going to want to take it to the next level with them. Because if I was successful running for mayor with public financing, or running a county council with public financing, I want to take that then to the state senate or the governor's mansion, where I will be successful again. And they will want to take that. And the more people that you have invested in the program, the more it will be easier for the reforms to take up on a higher level. So it's almost like a bottom-top approach here. You would want to start at the bottom, at the simplest levels here, and move your way up to the top there. I also think that you need to look at it, and the debate needs to change here as well here. That, I mean, the biggest problem is that the idea of viability. Well, will I be a viable candidate? Will I be considered a viable candidate? And this is basically coming from the federal levels down on states, and it's trickling down all the way down to state school board election races. Because I have a kind of a terrifying story here. I mean, basically, I have a candidate who was running for the school board member, but it was a student member, and they're capped at like $500 worth of expenditures, really hard stuff. And his friend called me up and said, well, I want to start a super PAC for my friend here, because every serious candidate has a super PAC, and I see it on the news every day. And I mean, that's how it starts. If he's going to run because he wants to be in the school board as the student member, that person is then going to say, well, when I run for county council, I'm going to need a super PAC, and then I'm going to need it for governor and everything else. And you see it coming from the federal side down, because you see how super PACs are working quite effectively at the top level, and now they're trickling down ballot at races where, Koch brothers, $1 billion makes a difference up at the federal level, but when you get to a governor's race where it's $19 million total, or even at a state senate race where it's $100,000 in certain levels here, the bang for their buck increases, and then they're going to start saying, well, now we have this prior relationship as we move forward here and move up. So it's better to counterbalance that at the lower level and say, no, I want to keep the public financing programs and move it up while they're coming down on your level here. So I think that it's important to show that the super PACs are not the answer to this here. So I believe that the one thing was that there is hope in this matter here. I want to leave with that. I mean, I look at it and say, I have a Republican governor who, last session, made good on his promise with a pledge. He mentioned in his State of the State speech about public financing. So one of his initiatives that was passed through a Democratic controlled General Assembly was the restoration of of the funding sources for the public financing mechanisms. We, of course, could not attach taxpayer money, but I mean, that's one of those things that you always have to deal with. But we've got the tax checkoff back on. We are able to then collect any of the fines from bad actors with campaign fines, or if they had any ethical fines, we get to collect those monies there and put it in the fund here. Now, you know, the fund is depleted immensely, but it's a step in the right direction. And it's one of those things that if you look at it, you have hope for the ability for this to move forward when you have, it's not just Democrats or not just progressives that are engaging in this debate here. You have to open it up. You have to change the debate, because if you don't, then they'll walk in there and immediately turn you off and say, well, this is the same story I've heard before. I'm glad that like the business communities are a part of this debate here and moving forward with it. So with that, I'm glad to be back in New York City. I was a New Jersey boy, so it's good to be back here. So thank you.
Thanks, Jared. So we're going to close out the presentations with one from Michael Malbin. Michael is the Executive Director of the Campaign Finance Institute, an organization the Brennan Center has been lucky enough to partner with a number of times in the last few years. He is a political science professor at the University of Albany, SUNY, and one of the country's leading scholars on campaign finance. Michael most recently has been studying two systems that on their face seem pretty similar, the Los Angeles public financing system and the New York City public financing system. They're both small donor public financing systems. And Michael's going to tell us, I think, a little bit about what's working and not working in New York City and Los Angeles, and what that tells us about how we should design public financing systems.
So thanks, Larry. And I want to join everybody who's been thanking the three organizations. This has been a great conference, and I really appreciate being part of it. And before I begin, I do want to acknowledge the fact that I have a co-author, Michael Parrott, who's sitting right here. And if you'll let people see you, Michael, don't be, okay, good. Thanks. I also want to say that I have all these slides. I said, Larry, I don't know how we're going to get through them in 10 minutes. He said, you can have an extra minute or two. Okay. So that means I'm going to talk fast. That also means there's going to be a lot of data that you won't be able to read. On the bottom of each slide is the Campaign Finance Institute's URL, www.cfinst.org. These slides are there. You may download them. As far as the general purpose of what I'm talking about today, most of the people today have talked about public financing broadly as being a good thing in general. This paper really is going to ask about specifics. Do the details affect results? And our answer broadly is yes, the details can matter a lot, and now the rest of the slides are about the evidence. Just as a matter of definition for all the slides, in all of the slides, trying to compare across jurisdictions, we're defining small donors as ones who gave $250 or less to a particular candidate. And that's what you'll see in all of the slides. A number of people earlier, starting with Fritz, gave you the basic outline of the New York City program. We don't need to spend a lot of time on it. Multiple matching funds began in 2001 with a little adjustment beginning with the election of 2009. In Los Angeles, multiple matching began with the election of 2013. It's a lower match, but it's in place. and that's what I'm going to be comparing. Many of you are familiar with the basic outlines of the Campaign Finance Institute's research on New York City. In terms of number of small donors, as we've published, the number of small donors per participating city council candidate went up when it went through a multiple matching system, and it went up per candidate even though the population per district went down. The percentage of money coming from small donors, the three bars on the left, went up in terms of percentage of private funds from small donors, and in terms of when you allocate the public matching funds, these small donors were responsible for nearly 60% of the total funds raised by candidates. And that doesn't include the matching funds that went to the people who raised $1,000 contributions. So the initial research was on the small New York City Council, and that's really what we talked up in the last several years, talking about New York City, New York State, and so forth. But lately, we've been doing a little more look and decided to look at the other offices. And I have to tell you, the results are not the same for all New York City offices. When you look at comparing the New York City Council with the mayoral elections, the New York City Council candidates got a third of their private funds from small donors, and the mayoral candidates got 9%. There's an similar disparity when you put in the public matching funds. And just for your information, in case you wondered, the other offices with larger constituencies, such as public advocate, borough president, and others, controller, they're about halfway between the mayor and the council candidates. So this led to some research questions. What's going on? It's the same program, different results in different offices. Is it really a difference between all mayors and city councils? Because after all, and by the way, after all, the mayor has got a lot of responsibility for things that people who can write $2,700 checks care about, like zoning and so forth. Is it about small versus large constituencies, since we're finding it for borough presidents and public advocates? Or is it something else? We really didn't know. This is a puzzle for us. So we decided to compare New York City with Los Angeles, and we did it because Los Angeles council members represent larger districts, and you also had another mayor to look at. And frankly, the results are puzzling, they're surprising, and we have more work to do, but we're sharing where we are. What happened when Los Angeles implemented multiple matching funds? Answer: number of small donors per candidate went down. I don't understand it. It's a fact. What happened to the percentage of money raised from small donors? It went down. And we're not just looking at different districts. They only we paired a couple of years together for Los Angeles. They stayed even when you added the public matching funds. But the two on the left, it went down. Then we said, okay, we got the mayor from New York City, we have both sets of offices from Los Angeles. Now you line them up in an array, and you look at all four, and what you're seeing is the city council in Los Angeles, the mayor in Los Angeles, the mayor in New York City are lower, and New York City is higher. New York City Council is higher. So there's something, and this is a percentage of money from private funds, percentage from private plus public, number of donors. I don't need to go through the details. The shape of the bars is the same. Okay, this is one of the interesting things and puzzles. And by the way, one of the things we were really interested in was what about small donor diversity, not just number and not just percentage of funds. Well, as you know, we did in the past a detailed analysis of census block groups, and we did it comparing New York City Council with Assembly. This time we did it in New York City compared to Los Angeles. And we see in both cities, and this is important, in both cities, small donors come from much more diverse neighborhoods than large donors. That's true in both cities. But it's more so, much more so, for New York City than Los Angeles. I'm not going to go through this chart in detail. You can download it. But basically, New York City Council candidates raise small contributions from 90% of the city's census block groups. And the ones they don't raise money from are, generally speaking, airports and parks. Whereas in Los Angeles, it's 2/3 of the census block groups. And in every measure you look at, whether it's household income, percent poverty, racial diversity, New York City Council is different from Los Angeles and more toward looking like what the city as a whole looks like. So we're wondering what's going on. What are the explanations? And frankly, we're still working on this. Why is it that New York City Council is different from New York City Mayor, Los Angeles Council, Los Angeles mayors? And so we're still exploring, but we think there are likely some structural issues at play that are going to be important as you design a potential law. For example, here are some possible non-campaign finance law explanations. One, people with money care more about mayors than council members. That makes a lot of sense. It helps explain why New York City's mayor is different from New York City Council, but it doesn't explain why Los Angeles Council is different from New York City Council. So it's something that's possible, but it's not satisfying. It's not enough. What about the idea that it's just larger constituencies, which is where we started when we looked at borough presidents and so forth? Well, Los Angeles City Council is about 250,000. New York City Council is about 160,000. Yeah, it's a different, but it's not big enough to be plausible explanation for the magnitude of the difference that we see. What about the programming itself? Here are some plausible possible explanations, which I do not pretend that we have proven, but they're plausible. Residency requirements, and I do think this is very plausible. In New York City Council, you have to have a minimum number of people who live in your districts in order to qualify for public funding. New York City Mayor just says you have to be from the city. That means it could all be in Wall Street and law firms, right? Los Angeles also, no geographic requirement for 2013. I'm thinking that has to make a difference. But in Los Angeles, controlled experiment, we're delighted to say, I love controlled experiments. They will have residency requirements in 2015. Give us some time and so forth and so on. We'll compare the 2 years. But I'm thinking that's plausible. What about the role of the threshold as a whole? Well, it turns out that in New York City, if you get your 70 contributions in district and you match them, you're pretty far along toward getting your spending limit. That's nowhere near true for mayor or for Los Angeles. You have to raise a lot more in private funds. 3, public funding in New York is 55% of the spending limit. Los Angeles, it's about half that. Again, I don't know, but these are all pretty plausible to me. Alternative explanations. Maybe it's because the mayoral contribution limits are too high. They're about double in New York for mayor as for city council. Well, so people, a lot of reform groups have started to ask, does it really make sense to match the first $175 for somebody who gives $2,500 or $2,700 or $4,950? That's a good question, but there's a problem coming with that question. Again, people who do that focus on the difference between mayor and city council in New York, but in Los Angeles, the contribution limits are half as high as New York City's. And in Los Angeles, council and mayor, as a result, much lower than New York City Council. It's more like the mayor. So the contribution limit is not going to explain it. I mean, and frankly, to me, that means that the evidence doesn't necessarily push you towards saying you have to have very low contribution limits, as some people are advocating now. Again, I'm not certain of this. I'm going to love to watch Montgomery County once they've gone through a full election cycle, since they in effect have a $150 contribution limit. But that's, maybe county office works differently. I don't know. It's a big county. So, but the other side of it that you have to look at is that if really low limits scare candidates away and make them decide not to opt in voluntarily, then frankly, your program has accomplished nothing. Because without voluntary participation, you don't have an effect. We expect, we don't assert this as a conclusion yet, we expect that there's a much more complicated interaction among all of the rules for qualifying, for donor residency, for contribution limits, and for matching funds. And it's not just any one thing, but they interact. And that's what you're going to have to look at if you want to understand that. For example, on matching, the old presidential system used to say, why can't you do this for mayor? It used to say you had to have a qualifying threshold in each of 20 states. I mean, you could do that for mayor. It doesn't have to be in-city contributions. It could be from, mayor has to raise money from each of X number of council districts. Anyway, the explanations are tentative, and we're going to be doing more in this, and we're going to want to add more cities, including Chicago. But we are certain, we feel comfortable about 2 points so far. One, not all matching funds have the same effects. And two, program details explain part of the difference. The bottom line for public financing, passing a bill is not enough. We heard that from Karen. We heard that on the first panel as well. It's not, the politics of persuasion is not enough. You need a program that will actually work and do its job well. Otherwise, the program won't have the staying power that Karen talked about. The fact that Connecticut legislators stay in the program while Arizonans are dropping out is important for whether that program will be sustained. And in order to get a program that will work its job well, that requires evidence and not just good rhetoric. And I would argue that a policy that works well is also not just good policy, but good politics over time to sustain a program. And for both, the details will matter.
Thank you, Michael. That was very interesting. We have time for just a couple questions, so I'm going to.
I can project. This is for Professor Malbin. In regards to the comparison between the LA Council and the New York Council, is it something as simple as 258,000 people in a district versus 160,000 in a district? You don't have the time to canvass the same number of people. You're going to go for sort of the deeper pockets up front, even if it includes some of the maximum funds.
Yeah, so the population of a New York City Council district is about 160,000. Los Angeles is 250. The difference in magnitude is about 3 or 4 times. So I don't think that's a big enough population difference. I think in New York, you are required to ask your constituents for money. In Los Angeles, you're not. You don't even have to ask people who are from the city. And that's going to change. But, Larry?
A quick confession, I'm a recovering politician from Maryland, and I was the author of the 1974 law that Jared has been implementing. And I assure you that when I wrote it in 1974, and we in Common Cause and other groups powered it through amidst a dozen scandals, we expected it would fund spunky liberal democratic candidates who wouldn't otherwise attract big corporate money. And in 40 years, as you heard, it has in fact funded 2 very conservative Republican candidates. So be careful what you wish for. I have been called out of retirement by the Montgomery County Council to assist them with the job of making the county's new program, which will have its first election cycle in 2018, have it be a big success. And the little committee I'm the chairman of has the job of trying to persuade them how much money they should be putting in the pot over the next several years. And these are tough budget times in our county, and so the amount that was expected to be put in this current budget cycle that just ended is only half, and we don't have a campaign finance board with the power to dictate how much money should be put in, which might be a fatal weakness. But I'm kind of a loss to understand how you make an intelligent prediction, since one of the biggest question marks is how many open seats are you going to have, because that is usually a source of a whole lot of candidacies. And the current betting in our county, which has one county executive and 9 council members, the betting is the exec won't run again for a 4th term, and that all 9 council members will run for county executive, which would touch off a flood of candidacies. So I'm hoping somebody's got an algorithm that we can point to how you make an intelligent guesstimate. I loved hearing how the New York board handled the last one. They said, well, we think we'll need $36 million, but hey, we'll round it up to 50 just to be safe. We sure wish we had that kind of clout. But if we don't, what do you suggest we do? And then I have, sorry to talk so long, I have a question for CED. Have any of your constituent companies sort of gotten into the game of holding forums for candidates so that their employees could hear the story and maybe make qualifying contributions? Has things gotten that far in any of these jurisdictions?
No.
Not yet.
But right now, it's from the CED standpoint, it's trying to get business leaders to support the policy change and then talk to leaders and policymakers about that change. But we haven't gotten to that.
I don't know if anybody has an answer to the first question.
I can just offer, do you want to? You know, when we were trying to figure out participation rate in Connecticut, a lot of what would go through the legislature was, let's try 50%, which would have been a dramatic dip in what actually our first year it was 74%. So we definitely increased that out of fear to make sure that you have enough money. So we looked at programs like Arizona and Maine to see, you know, Arizona came in at 33%. Maine had much more robust participation. So we erred on the side of caution because you don't want a situation where you just don't have enough money. And that money hopefully will carry forward for the next cycle. And so we erred on the side of caution when we were looking at that.
I just also want to,
Okay, when Campaign Finance Institute has done cost estimates for a number of jurisdictions, and they're tough, they're notoriously tough. But what we started with is we said, let's look at the same candidates and same donors as last time. 1. 2, we assume 100% participation, which we know is too high. 3, assume no new donors come in. Then you get a baseline, which is a low number. 4, assume that the candidates will, let's say, some reasonable estimate for new donors. And then when we put that in for New York State, the budget people came back to us and said, well, there are going to be new candidates, aren't there? And there will be, of course. And what you have to start looking at is you have to look at the history of what happens when you have open seats, which you can do. And when you are the most conservative, most liberal, however you want to say it, estimate possible, you're going to come up with a number that in terms of government expenditures is really low, other government expenditures. And you want, in the first election, to try to hold the council's feet to the fire if you can on that issue, but you want to come in with an estimate that assumes everybody plays, new candidates are going to come in and threaten, And don't forget the administrative costs. I don't really know whether in Montgomery County's case, all of those are bucked over to Jared
Yeah.
or not.
I take over them.
That's really unfortunate because they haven't increased your budget, right?
No, they have not.
Right.
No, yeah.
If it's other jurisdictions, include them, and that's another serious amount. The cost of matching funds that we estimated in New York State was something like, if I'm not mistaken, 40 or 50 million per year over a 4-year cycle, which is peanuts in terms of the New York State $110 billion budget. But then on top of that, New York City helped with doing an New York City Campaign Finance Support in terms of doing an administrative cost for a serious program, and that added another 50%, another 20 million, which is still peanuts on the New York budget. But you have to include that when you're doing the work.
So I think we have time for just one more question. Liz?
Thanks. I was wondering, Professor Malbin, have you also looked at the effect on participation rates for vouchers or credit programs, since those are now
Since they don't exist. That is to say, it's really difficult to do an empirical analysis of something nobody's tried yet. I'm assuming that they would have high participation rates, but I don't know. I can tell you on tax credits, if you don't mind my saying so, because Minnesota has a rebate system, which works a little like a voucher system. That's about a 6% participation rate, which is about the same as the highest public matching fund. It's a high rate. If what you're looking at is strictly citizen participation, Minnesota and Oregon, which lets you give money to PACs, are pretty high. Other states are really low, like percentage of 1%, which is another part of the story Karen was underlining, which is that implementation matters.
All right, well, thanks very much to our panelists.
Thank you.